guys, it's Harley. So today I thought we would talk all about houseplant propagation, and I'll be telling you how I personally choose to propagate 20 different types of houseplants. I think many of us can agree that propagating houseplants is one of the most rewarding, fun / best parts about keeping houseplants in the first place. I don't know about the rest of you, but I genuinely enjoy taking a cutting off of my plant and making more free plant, especially for those of us that want our inside to feel like we're outside. Just keep in mind that these are my preferred methods for propagating these kinds of houseplants. If you have a different method you prefer, please share it in the comments down below. There are so many different ways to propagate pretty much every variety of plant. Just because I prefer a different way than you prefer doesn't mean either of us is wrong. We just have different tastes. As a general rule of thumb, before we get into the specific plant types and propagations, there are a few things I like to keep in mind when propagating. So number one, I do like to give the propagating cuttings of the plant higher light than I normally would give the mother plant, if that makes sense. They do require a lot more energy to push roots. Yeah, I do like to give them a little bit higher light, and I've had success with this. That's not to say if you have a low light plant, I'm not saying put it in direct sunlight, but maybe move it slightly closer to the window. So just something to keep in mind. And then another thing is there are exceptions to this rule, of course, but for the most part, when I'm taking a cutting from a plant, if I choose to propagate it in soil, which I don't choose to do that with many of the plants I'm going to talk about, but there are a few. If I do put them in soil, I definitely like to keep cuttings in soil watered a lot more than I would if it was still attached to the mother plant. My brain is going in and out, you guys. Higher light, higher water. I guess that also kind of applies to if you choose to propagate in water. When you go to move those propagations to soil, once you have the 2-3 inches of root growth like we talk about in the video, once you move those water propagations into soil, definitely remember to keep them adequately watered. And again, I still do prefer to give them higher light until it is an established plant with new growth coming out from like the actual plant portion itself. I do also like to keep a very airy soil mixture when I'm propagating plants or when I've moved a water propagation into soil. Everything I use for my soil mix will be in the description box down below if you want to try the products I love. I wouldn't recommend anything I don't personally use myself. Let's just get into it. First up are Maranta plants. So this includes Calathea, Stromanth. My favorite way to propagate these plants is by taking cuttings and propagating them in water. Calathea plants in particular are water-loving, thirsty little babies. So keeping them in water for me helps negate a lot of the issues I have with keeping them watered initially in soil, because I do find that most plants, when you are propagating them, they need like an excess of everything. So they need higher light than they normally would and more water than they normally would. Keeping them in water, especially for water, humid, those kind of loving plants, works really well. I have also been known to separate crowns off of these kinds of plants. To separate the crowns, you just take a look at your plant, and where there's different little stems in the soil, usually you'll have one main stem cluster of the plant, but then usually plants will offshoot a little bit, so you can go ahead and separate those offshoots, make a new plant. The cool thing about separating the crowns is that you have a plant that's ready to be potted. The odds of it surviving, I think, are a lot better just because it already has a developed root system. So when you're separating those crowns, you do have to take the plant out of the pot and repot that plant. That's just one of the reasons I don't use this method as frequently, only if I'm like already repotting a plant. If you separate it this way, you can just go ahead and plant that separated crown into a new pot in new soil. Peace lily. The best way, in my opinion, to propagate a peace lily is to, again, separate the plant or the crowns. It is ideal to find the separate little crowns and take maybe 1 or 2 of those off of the mother plant and pot them up together in a separate pot in fresh soil. But you can also divide the roots if your plant hasn't developed little offshoot crown things yet. Basically what you'll do is pull your plant out of the soil and just go ahead and cut through the roots. Just make sure that however you're cutting the roots, there is enough root system to support the plant. So be sure that there's at least 2 inches of root on the piece you're trying to cut off. Pothos are the easiest plant to propagate. They form root systems so freaking quickly. How I like to propagate pothos is I will cut off one of the more leggy vines. This helps promote the plant to grow bushier and more full looking. On the vine, I usually try to have at least a few few leaves. I'll just cut on the stem so that there's just a couple of inches of stem between each leaf, and then I'll pop those in water. You can also pop them in soil. I just really prefer watching the root systems form until you get about 2 inches of root growth, and then go ahead and plant it in soil. To propagate cast iron plants, I definitely recommend root separation. Typically should wait until it's time to repot your plant to do this. When it's getting closer and closer to repotting, then that's maybe when you'll consider doing this. But I definitely recommend root division. So when you're repotting your plant, you're just going to take a sharp knife or sharp scissors and cut through the roots to separate a few of the stems off of that main plant, and you can go ahead and just pot that directly into soil. Cast iron plant is one I definitely prefer to put directly into soil because they are very susceptible to root rot. Ficus plants are another one of my favorites to propagate. There are actually a few ways you can do this. You can go ahead and take cuttings off of the top section of the plant where the new growth is still soft. Like if you're looking at a ficus plant, usually there'll be hard like bark at the bottom of the plant, but then the younger growth at the top stays a little more flimsy and lighter in color until it grows more. So you can go ahead and cut off of the top of there, pull off like the bottom leaf, let it callus over for a couple of hours, and then go ahead and plop it into water. Again, I like water propagating these, that way I can keep tabs on the roots. My Ficus Audrey tends to branch off quite frequently. So for ficus plants like that branch quite a bit, I prefer to cut off the branches, especially so my plant doesn't lean, and propagate those. You can also, I've seen people on Instagram propagate just individual leaves. One thing to note about that is it's not going to grow into a full plant. So yes, that leaf may form roots. It's going to stay a leaf. If you like the look of that, I think it's pretty cool looking, then go ahead and do it, but just keep in mind that it's going to stay that way. Hoya are a little bit more difficult to get to root in my experience. With Hoya, I do still prefer to take cuttings. What I'll do is I'll put them directly into a very airy soil mixture, and then what I'll do is I'll take my cutting, plop it into that soil, water the soil really thoroughly. Then I like using a propagation box method for this because I don't live in a very humid state, so the propagation box helps keep humidity trapped in on the plants, and it helps them grow a lot more quickly. You can also do this in a Ziploc bag now that I think about it, but I've just always used a box. Yeah, basically all you'll do, put your Hoya or other humid loving plants into the propagation box. You'll want to put it outside where it doesn't get direct sunlight, but it does get light. That's why I prefer to keep it outside, but you can keep it inside in bright indirect light as well if you prefer to do that. And then you're just going to keep tabs on it. Water it every week or so, and mist in there works really well, and I've found that it makes Hoya plants root a lot more quickly. For propagating spider plants, I definitely prefer taking off those little babies it gives us. It's basically giving us free plants. Might as well take advantage of that. So basically what I do is I just cut off one of the little spider plants, plop it into water or soil. I kind of do it both interchangeably, and it'll grow roots. These ones are very easy to propagate, but you can also divide the roots or separate crowns as well. Monstera is probably the plant I propagate the most. I don't know why. I don't know. I just really like to get babies of this one and plant them together so it's a really bushy looking Monstera. You know what I mean? But basically all I'll do on Monstera plants, they do form aerial roots, and these are the roots that kind of shoot out of the side and look a little funky off of the stems of the plant. I'll just find one of those. It doesn't matter how big it is or how small it is. Cut just below that, maybe a ½ inch below that. Let that cutting callus over for an hour or two, and then I'll go ahead and plop it in soil. Monstera are another really fun one to watch propagate in soil, and they do root pretty quickly. I do have two methods for propagating Syngonium. I use it frequently. So you can separate the crowns. This is ideal for maybe a little bit younger plants that haven't started vining. It can be quite stressful to the plant, so I try to avoid this if possible. If there's a vine I can cut, I go ahead and do that instead, but this is just if your plant hasn't started vining but you really want to separate separate it. Or you can go ahead and cut off a vine. You can keep it as a longer vine, or you can cut individual leaves off of the vine similar to how you propagate a pothos and plop it in water. They do really well in water. To propagate Schefflera, I can't even say it anymore. To propagate Schefflera? Why is that so hard for me to say? I think it's best to take cuttings from the top of the plant. So again, similar to the ficus plants we talked about earlier, as the plant grows, the stems harden towards the bottom. So what you're going to try to do is cut that softer growth off of the top. I do recommend pulling off the bottom few leaves so that there are at least one exposed node. And I do like to root these ones in water because they are thirsty little babies in my experience. And this is one that definitely prefers higher light if you can give it to them while it's propagating. If it's getting that higher light, I'm not saying direct light, but maybe a little bit closer to a window than it was before, then it'll push those roots out so fast. Begonias are one I definitely like to just snip off the top. It helps the plant push growth towards the bottom midsection of the plant, making it look a lot more full. It can lead to a thicker plant and then also plus a free plant. It's a 2-for-1. So yeah, I will just go ahead and cut off the top, not pull off any leaves, just stick that stem into some room temperature water, keep it as humid as possible, and they do pretty well this way. With ZZ, I know a lot of people definitely prefer to separate crowns of the plant, but I don't know why, I just have always had a hard time with this, so I do prefer to take cuttings from the main plant. So I'll just cut one of the, what are they called, stalks? I'll cut a stalk at the base and pull off the bottom couple leaves, put it in water, and then wait 4 months for it to develop roots. One thing to keep in mind about propagating ZZ is it does take so long for roots to form. You can also stick it in soil, and I have also done that and had success with it, but again, I just like to watch so that I know when roots are forming, so I'm not like pulling the stalk every single day to see if there's roots down there, if there's any resistance. When it does get roots though, this one is one of the more exciting plants to propagate in my opinion, just because it does require a lot of patience. Scindapsus plants are another one of my favorites to propagate, probably because they're one of my favorites. But what I'll do is I will cut a vine off and then just cut each individual leaf. This is one of the few plants I do prefer to soil propagate. All I'll do is fill a pot with soil, take those little individual cuttings and pop them right into the soil. One thing is I don't water this right away as I'm putting them into the soil. I do give it a few days and then I will very thoroughly water it. Once I notice the outsides of the leaves begin to curl, then I'll go ahead and give it a good water, and that seems to work really well for me. And you can kind of use whatever soil mix you want for this. For the money tree, I like to take cuttings from the top of the plant where the growth is still soft, like we talked about earlier. On this one in particular, I do make sure to just cut right below a leaf. Then I'll just pull off that bottom leaf that I took the cutting right underneath, put her in some shallow water. I do actually tend to give these ones like as close to direct light indoors as possible without it being actually super direct, and I've had really great success with this one. And these ones do transfer very easily into soil once it's time to do that. And again, I just wait for the roots to be about 2 inches long and then I'll plop them in that soil, keep it well watered for the first little while, and does well. I'm not actually going to separate my bird of paradise in this video, but I've considered it. I'm just not ready to go for it yet. You know what I mean? I'm just not ready. But how I would propagate this bird of paradise is go to repot the plant, of course, and then I would just separate these individual crowns. So my plant in particular has 3 crowns forming, and as they age and mature a little bit or get a little more compact in their pot, they will start to push new, we'll just call them plant babies, from out of the soil. So that's how you get a new crown. Cut the roots, take off one of those individual crowns, put her in a pot, and call it good. Pilea Peperomoides plants are so popular because they are very easy to get new free plants from. So of course you can take the babies off of the plants, and how you do this is wait for it to push a plant baby. This typically happens when it starts to get a little more compact in the pot, then it'll start pushing out that new growth from around the edges of the pot usually. But what you can do is kind of move the soil away as much as you can from that specific section where the baby is growing and reach as far down as you can with a sharp knife or scissors. I do actually prefer a razor blade for this. And then just slice as far down on the root system as you can without actually cutting too many of the roots off of the mother plant, you know what I mean? Go ahead and pot it in soil. This is one I do not like to propagate in water, so definitely recommend putting it in soil. Aglaonema or Chinese evergreens are so underrated in my opinion. You know what? There are so many beautiful varieties. Why aren't more people talking about them, you know? This one is also really fun to propagate, so you can take cuttings off of this plant. I definitely don't prefer to do that because it is always putting out new shoots. I mean, and by shoots I mean plant babies. So I'll just go ahead and separate those shoots and call it good. This is one where they are very susceptible to root rot, so I don't like to propagate them in water. I'll just put these ones in soil. Gosh, there are so many different varieties of Peperomia and so many different ways to propagate the different varieties of Peperomia, but I would say overall, my favorite way to propagate Peperomia as a whole is to take a cutting and just stick that cutting directly into water. These ones I do wait for the root systems to get quite large before repotting them, so normally I'll wait for the root systems to be about 2 inches long before I move them into soil, but Peperomia, I do like to wait until the root system looks very proportional to the plant. A little bit smaller than the actual cutting itself, if that makes sense. That may seem excessive, it may seem wrong, but that's how I do it and I've had really good success with this. Of course, you can do it however you prefer. I don't know. What's your favorite way to propagate Peperomia? For Rhipsalis, I do like to actually propagate these babies in soil. I'll wait for the plant to put growth off of the sides of one of its tendrils. When they're feeling happy with their life, then they just plop out those new little tendrils off of the sides of their things. Why can't I don't know words? How do I explain you? Anyway, you can really take a cutting from anywhere on this plant and put it in soil and it'll probably grow, but I do just like to wait until it puts off those like sideways growths from one of the tendrils. Is any of this making sense? And then I'll just stick it in some dry soil and call it good. I do keep these ones a little bit more dry than I would most other types of plant that I'm propagating, just because I found that the ones that I have in my collection do prefer to stay a little bit dry, but that's just in my experience. The two main ways I propagate Burro's tail is to, of course, pluck off the little jelly bean leaf things and sit them in the pot next to the mother plant, and eventually it'll grow a new plant, but that does take quite a long time. So another thing you can do that I have done before is you can just cut off a piece of the plant. Really anywhere on the plant, if it's long enough to take a cut, you can go ahead and take a cut, put it in soil, keep it pretty dry, wait for the little jelly beans to shrivel up before watering it, and you'll get roots in no time. But I do like to give this one direct sunlight as it's propagating. I mean, I pretty much give mine direct sunlight anyway, but especially when it's propagating, it's super important. Okay, so those were all 20 of the plants I will be talking about in this video. Let me know what you think in the comments. If there's a propagation method for a specific plant type I said that you don't agree with, please share what you prefer to do in the comments. I think it's really helpful for people reading through those comments to have input from various different sources, because again, it does really depend on where we live. So what works for me may not necessarily work for all of you. That information is very much appreciated. That is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!